10 underrated British war dramas of the 1940s. War cinema. You think you know it? Heroic speeches, stiff upper lips, soldiers charging into glory. But what if I told you the most daring, most haunting British war dramas of the 1940s aren't the ones you've heard of? Hidden gems, forgotten reels, stories buried under the noise of propaganda and polished epics. These films didn't just entertain, they whispered uncomfortable truths. So let me ask you, are you ready to uncover the war dramas history tried to keep quiet? The Day Will Dawn, 1942, also called The Avengers. Picture this: Europe, 1942. The Nazis are spreading like wildfire, and Britain is desperate to remind its people that courage still burns bright. Enter The Day Will Dawn, a film that blended espionage, sabotage, and the spirit of resistance into something rawer than the polished wartime classics. The story? Hugh Williams plays a journalist in neutral Norway who stumbles into Nazi operations. Suddenly, he's no longer just writing headlines. He's living them, dodging Gestapo agents, decoding betrayal, and working with local resistance fighters. What makes this film remarkable is how unflinching it was for its time. It's less about stiff uniforms and more about the murky, dangerous gray zones of war, where ordinary people risked everything in shadowy battles the public rarely saw. Here's the kicker. The film was retitled The Avengers in America, decades before Marvel ever thought of assembling heroes. But this was no comic book. It's a gritty portrait of journalists, fishermen, and civilians caught in the crossfire, asked to become heroes without the luxury of choice. The Norwegian setting, icy and treacherous, becomes its own character, a frozen mirror to the chilling stakes. And did you know? The movie was a bold piece of propaganda disguised as thrilling entertainment. It wasn't just telling you to fight, it was telling you to spy, to resist, to stay vigilant. Historians now point out that it helped shape the way the British public imagined occupied Europe, seeding both dread and determination. Watch closely, and you'll notice its DNA in later war films, from Ill Met by Moonlight to The Heroes of Telemark. But unlike those, The Day Will Dawn doesn't get trotted out in glossy retrospectives. It sits in the shadows, waiting for cinephiles like you to dig it back up. Cottage to Let, 1941. Now, let's move from icy Norway to the rolling hills of Scotland, where danger lurks not on the battlefield, but behind cottage doors. Cottage to Let. On paper, it looks like a quaint wartime mystery, but what it really delivers is a sharp, nerve-wracking story of spies, suspicion, and the paranoia of homefront Britain. The setup? A brilliant Scottish inventor is working on a revolutionary new weapon, and his countryside cottage becomes the unlikely stage for intrigue. Refugees, convalescent soldiers, and evacuee children move through the house, each guest more mysterious than the last. But here's the twist. One of them isn't who they claim to be. Somewhere in those cozy rooms lurks a Nazi agent embedded deep, waiting for the right moment to strike. Sound familiar? It should. Cottage to Let is one of the earliest films to capture the enemy among us paranoia that would later dominate Cold War thrillers. The genius here lies in the tension between the ordinary and the extraordinary. A cup of tea, a fireside chat, and then, suddenly, treachery in the air. This wasn't just entertainment. Released in 1941, at the height of fears about German spies infiltrating Britain, the movie doubled as a warning: trust no one blindly. And here's a hidden gem for film buffs. It featured a young George Cole, who would later rise to fame in British cinema and television. Watching him as a wide-eyed evacuee is like seeing a future star sharpen his craft on the edge of war. What makes Cottage to Let underrated is its refusal to glamorize. Unlike the grand propaganda films that thundered with speeches about duty, this one whispered a quieter, creepier truth. The war wasn't just out there. It was inside your walls. And that message hit harder for many viewers than any rousing battlefield victory. It's a war film without tanks or trenches, yet every bit as dangerous. It reminds us that during the 1940s, Britain's most fragile battleground wasn't always overseas. Sometimes it was the hearth, the family, the cottage just down the road. The Demi-Paradise, 1943. Wartime Britain didn't just need bullets and bombers. It needed stories of unity. That's where The Demi-Paradise comes in, a film often overlooked but quietly groundbreaking. Starring none other than Laurence Olivier, it dared to tell a tale not about soldiers in battle, but about cultural understanding, unlikely friendship, and the bonds forged under fire. The plot follows Ivan Kuznetsov, a Russian engineer who travels to Britain to work on a new propeller design. Olivier, in one of his most unconventional roles, plays him with warmth and charm, reminding us that not all wartime heroes wore uniforms. At its heart, this is a story of bridges built between nations. The British audiences of 1943 were told, through Ivan's journey, that their Soviet allies were partners worth trusting. Did you know this film was one of the first to humanize Russian characters for British cinema? Before the Cold War chilled relations, Britain and the Soviet Union were wartime partners. The film practically begged audiences to set aside prejudice, to laugh and cry with someone who, just years earlier, might have been viewed with suspicion. But make no mistake, this isn't a lecture. It's witty, funny, and even romantic at times. Margaret Rutherford steals scenes with her comedic brilliance, grounding the drama with doses of warmth. And there's something magical in how the film balances propaganda with genuine storytelling. It wasn't just telling people what to think, it was showing them why it mattered. Looking back now, the Demi-Paradise feels like a time capsule of hope. It's a reminder that even in the darkest years of war, cinema dared to dream of collaboration, understanding, and yes, peace. Underrated? Absolutely. Essential? Without a doubt. Went the day well? 1942. Now we dive into one of the boldest war dramas ever made, Went the Day Well. Directed by Alberto Cavalcanti for Ealing Studios, it takes the quiet safety of an English village and shatters it with a premise so chilling it still holds power today. Imagine this. A small countryside community welcomes a platoon of soldiers, believing they're British troops on training maneuvers. The villagers offer tea, kindness, and trust. But slowly, alarmingly, the truth slips out. These men are not allies at all. They're German soldiers in disguise preparing for invasion. The shock of betrayal hits harder because the film doesn't shy away from showing the cost. Villagers, ordinary men and women, are forced into resistance. And the film does the unthinkable for 1942. It shows civilians dying on screen. That raw honesty set it apart from many wartime dramas that leaned on comforting heroics. Did you know this film was based on a short story by Graham Greene? His fingerprints are all over it. The suspicion, the quiet dread, the sudden bursts of violence that feel almost too real for their time. Critics have since called it one of the most daring British films of the era, precisely because it didn't sugarcoat the stakes. And here's the fascinating part. The movie wasn't just entertainment. It was a warning. Britain feared invasion in those early years of war, and Went the Day Well asked its audience a piercing question. What would you do if the enemy was in your backyard? Ealing Studios would later become famous for comedies like Kind Hearts and Coronets and The Lavender Hill Mob. But in this film, they went dark, gritty, and unflinchingly real. Watching it now feels less like history and more like a survival guide whispered through time. The Volunteer, 1943. Some war films were designed to dazzle with spectacle. Others whispered quietly but powerfully about duty and sacrifice. The Volunteer sits firmly in the second camp. Directed by Michael Powell and Emmerich Pressburger, the genius duo behind The Life and Death of Colonel Blimp and A Matter of Life and Death, this short drama doesn't have sprawling battlefields, but it has heart, poetry, and purpose. The story is simple. Ralph Richardson, one of Britain's great actors, plays himself, narrating the journey of his young stagehand who leaves the theater to join the Royal Air Force. It's not a tale of generals or medals. It's the story of ordinary men, plucked from ordinary lives, stepping into extraordinary roles. What makes it shine is the way it blurs fact and fiction. Actors play themselves, real RAF pilots appear on screen, and in just 40 minutes, the film paints a portrait of courage so personal it lingers long after the credits. Did you know this was made for the Ministry of Information? It was propaganda, yes, but not the thunderous flag-waving kind. This was intimate propaganda. The kind that said, your neighbor, your son, your theater usher, he could be the one defending the skies tomorrow. And because Powell and Pressburger never did anything halfway, they infused it with artistry, stunning camera work, haunting music, and that unique blend of realism and magic they were famous for. It's easy to miss The Volunteer when discussing British war films, but skip it and you miss a vital piece of wartime storytelling. This wasn't about showing how Britain fought. It was about showing who Britain was. The October Man, 1947. Now let's step into the shadows. Not every war drama was about bombs or battlefields. Some were about what happened after. The quiet, invisible wars waged in the mind. That's where The October Man comes in, a noir-soaked psychological drama that rarely gets mentioned alongside traditional war films, but deserves its place in the conversation. John Mills stars as Jim Ackland, a man recovering from a traumatic accident during the war. The scars aren't just physical, they're emotional, mental, lingering like ghosts. When he tries to rebuild his life, he finds himself entangled in suspicion after a woman is murdered. Suddenly, his fragile grip on reality is questioned. Is he guilty? Or is he simply broken by what the war left behind? This isn't a film about propaganda, it's about aftermath, and that's what makes it so powerful. In 1947, Britain was still picking up the pieces. Cities were bombed out husks, families fractured, and countless men returned home carrying wounds no one could see. The October Man dared to show that psychological toll. It's moody, atmospheric, and drenched in the kind of shadowy cinematography that makes every corner feel dangerous. Did you know the screenplay was written by Eric Ambler, one of the great spy novelists of the 20th century? That's why the film hums with tension, suspicion, and paranoia. It isn't just a murder mystery, it's a study of what war does to the human spirit. John Mills gives one of his most underrated performances here. No grand speeches, no heroic marches, just a man wrestling with himself in a world that no longer feels safe. For audiences in the late 1940s, that struck close to home. And today, it reminds us that the costs of war don't stop when the guns go quiet. The Next of Kin, 1942. Some films entertained, others warned. The Next of Kin was a warning shot across Britain's bow, and it hit hard. Released in 1942, this film didn't cloak its message in sentimentality or rousing speeches. Instead, it offered a stark, brutal reminder: careless words can kill. The story begins with a seemingly innocent slip of the tongue. Soldiers chatting, civilians gossiping, small details casually shared. But those fragments of conversation travel, and before long, they're in enemy hands. The result? A military operation is compromised, men die, and the finger points back not to the enemy, but to Britain itself. Did you know this film began as a short instructional training movie? The concept proved so powerful that it was expanded into a full-length feature, with Leslie Banks taking the lead. Its style is part documentary, part thriller, grim, direct, and deliberately unsettling. At a time when most war dramas tried to comfort or inspire, The Next of Kin wanted to scare its audience into silence. And it worked. What makes this film underrated is its honesty. It refused to romanticize war. Instead, it forced people to face the idea that they, in their daily lives, could endanger the very men fighting for them. That message was so raw that some audiences initially found it too bleak. Yet today, it stands as one of the most important examples of wartime cinema doing more than entertain. It was education wrapped in drama, and it saved lives by reminding people to think before they spoke. The Captive Heart, 1946. After the guns went quiet, Britain faced another story. What about the men who had been held prisoner, their lives frozen for years in barbed wire camps? The Captive Heart answers that question with haunting beauty. Michael Redgrave stars as a Czech officer who assumes the identity of a dead British soldier to avoid Nazi persecution. Captured and sent to a POW camp, he must live the lie while forging connections with fellow prisoners. The film balances two worlds: the quiet, suffocating camaraderie of the camp and the letters home that reveal the families left behind. It's not an action film. It's a human film. The tension doesn't come from escape attempts or battlefield clashes, but from the quiet endurance of men stripped of everything but hope. Redgrave delivers one of his most moving performances, torn between survival and loyalty, identity and truth. Did you know many of the extras were actual former POWs? That authenticity bleeds through every frame, giving the film a realism that hits deeper than polished sets or staged battles. And unlike many wartime dramas that ended with triumphant fanfare, this one closes with bittersweet honesty. Freedom, yes, but also loss, grief, and the weight of years stolen. Underrated? Absolutely. Too often overshadowed by flashier war films, The Captive Heart remains one of the quiet masterpieces of the era, reminding us that survival is its own form of heroism. Waterloo Road, 1945. Most war dramas of the 1940s focused on the battlefield. But Waterloo Road did something different. It turned its gaze inward, onto the streets and living rooms of wartime London. The bombs may have been falling overseas, but the battles here were heartbreak, betrayal, and the struggle to hold a family together. The film follows John Mills as Jim Coulter, a soldier who goes AWOL after hearing that a slimy draft dodger named Ted Purvis is circling his wife back home. What follows is part domestic drama, part gritty slice-of-life story, and part social commentary. Instead of medals and glory, Waterloo Road delivers tension born from jealousy, temptation, and the sacrifices demanded by war. Did you know the film was shot in the real streets of South London, giving it an authenticity few wartime dramas could match? Director Sidney Gilliat wasn't afraid to show the cracks in British society, men too eager to avoid the front, women left vulnerable and lonely, soldiers torn between duty and desire. At a time when propaganda often painted war as noble and clean, this film leaned into the messiness of real life. And that's what makes it so underrated. It doesn't thunder with speeches or wave the Union Jack. It whispers a darker truth, that while men were away fighting, their homes weren't standing still. Love triangles, broken promises, and the quiet ache of absence defined just as much of the war experience as any battle. Waterloo Road dared to show it. The Small Back Room, 1949. If Waterloo Road dealt with the home front, then the small back room drilled into the inner war, the battle of mind, body, and spirit. Directed by the legendary duo Powell and Pressburger, this moody drama unfolds not in trenches or skies, but in cramped offices and lonely pubs where a crippled bomb disposal expert fights both his demons and his duty. David Farrar plays Sammy Rice, a scientist with a damaged leg and a damaged heart. His job, to solve the mystery of German booby-trap bombs terrorizing the countryside. But his real struggle is internal: addiction, despair, and the sense of being discarded by the very war machine he serves. Did you know the climactic sequence where Rice defuses a bomb on Chesil Beach was hailed as one of the most suspenseful scenes ever shot in British cinema? Powell and Pressburger turned the simple act of cutting wires into pure psychological warfare. The ticking bomb becomes a metaphor for Rice himself, unsteady, volatile, one wrong move from disaster. What sets this film apart is its refusal to sugarcoat. It doesn't pretend all heroes were perfect or that every battle was noble. It shows the quiet suffering of those who worked in the shadows, unsung and unseen, and it's drenched in expressionistic cinematography. Shadows swallowing rooms, bottles looming like monsters, every frame echoing Rice's fractured state of mind. The Small Back Room isn't just a war film. It's a study of what war leaves behind in a man's soul. Underrated? More like underappreciated genius. So there you have it. 10 British war dramas of the 1940s that didn't just play on the silver screen. They etched themselves into the hidden corners of history. They weren't all parades and patriotism. They were shadows, whispers, and truths too real to forget. Which of these films surprised you the most? Drop your thoughts below. And if you crave more untold stories of Hollywood and beyond, hit like, subscribe, and remember, our reel never stops spinning.